Alright, in this lecture we will start building our Python script, which is the backbone of our web application. What we have so far is the front end, so we have the index.html page, which when you enter some data there and you submit, an HTTP post method is being triggered, and that post method navigates to this success.html site. And underneath this method is sending the email and the height. Now we want to make use of this pair of data and use it in Python. So, and we also got this static where we have this CSS file. Great. Now let's go ahead and create the Python script. But first, as you know from the section where we built this website with Flask earlier in the course, you need to create a virtual environment. You can also make it without using a virtual environment, but it's a good idea to have it because it helps you isolate your environment in a fresh Python installation, which later you can use for deploying your web application on the cloud or on the web server. So I'll open a terminal here, shift right click, open command window here, and you want to make sure you have virtual env installed. So pip install virtual env, I have it installed. And then once you have installed it, you go ahead and say Python with the env flag venv and the name of the folder where you want your virtual environment to be created. And this should be virtual. If you are on a Linux, you'd have to write here virtual env. And I believe this should be virtual env on a Mac too. But on Windows, you write venv and virtual, the name of the folder. Yeah, that created an empty folder for now. Another folder is being populated with an installation of Python and pip as well. Yeah, that's done. So yeah, inside here, as you see, we have this scripts folder where you can find Python, so Python, and also pip. So that suggests that you can now, in your terminal, you can go ahead and point to the virtual folder, so virtual, and then script, and pip at the end, and then install Flask. So that's one way to do it. Which means you are using your virtual Python, the Python that you just installed with the virtual env, to install Flask. So Flask will be installed for your virtual environment. Or another way to do it, so we did this way when we built a website with Python. Now I want to show you another way, which goes by pointing to activate, which is here, activate, pointing to this bat file, and that will trigger your virtual environment in the console, which means if you just type Python now, that means the Python of your virtual environment will be triggered. So let me exit this. And similarly, when you run your Python Flask, you can do Python and the name of your app. Or you can do it the old way, like we used to do it, so virtual scripts and then /Python and then point to your app.py file. So some people use it explicitly without activating the environment, but some others just activate it and then they use that environment. Throughout these lectures, we'll be using this activate because I think will help us to be more focused on the main things and not think about passing paths there. And it's also good for me not to type this thing all the time while I'm talking. So I hope that is clear. So let me go ahead and do pip install Flask now. That was successful. And now I'll go ahead and open Atom. So make sure you open it in here. If you're using other editors, now you need to create a Python file in your main folder. So I'll call this app.py And so that's in the same level with templates, static, and the virtual folder. So what I'll do now is I'll think about the structure of my app.py file. I'll create these functions and also import the libraries that I need. And for now, let's only think about how to get the email address and the height entered by the user. So we need Flask, from Flask import Flask. We also want the render template method, which will render our HTML templates. And we also need request from Flask. And with requests, we will be able to access these HTTP requests that is being made from the browser. And then we can read these requests, so we can fetch this email address and the height. We'll see how we'll implement that in a while. And then the usual things, so app equals to Flask and name. So I assume you know what these do, because you should have taken the lecture where we built this Flask website. So that should be clear. And yeah, then we need a function with a decorator. So app.root, and so when the user visits the home page, this function will be executed. Let's call this index. This will return render template index.html. So with this, Python should be able to go to the templates folder and get the index.html file and render it in the home page. That's clear, I believe. And yeah, we can test that, but first we need this block. So if name equals to main, which means if the script is being executed and not being imported, we'll execute these lines. So app.debug, we want to set it to true, and also app.run, we want to run the application in the default port. So if I don't give any port here, this application will run on port 5000. If you want to specify a port, you do something like 5001, for instance. I'll leave it empty. Yes, this should work now, so I'll go ahead and try this. And I'm using my computer terminal because the terminal embedded in Atom was having some bug at the moment. So it's the same thing, that shouldn't be a problem. Yeah, so I'm in an active virtual environment there, so I'll go ahead and python app.py and execute. So this is saying that my application is running on this IP, which is equivalent to localhost and column 5000. So I'll trigger the browser now and go to localhost 5000. Yeah, here is the application. It looks pretty much done, but we're not there yet. We have quite a lot of things to do. So this is not even finding the success.html page. And it says the requested URL was not found on the server. And the reason to that is because this index.html, so when the user presses that button, this action is being executed. So the application is trying to find the success.html, but it doesn't find it, and the reason to that is because we haven't rendered that HTML file in any of our mappings here. So here we are mapping this URL, and there we are rendering this index.html, but not success.html. So we want to create a decorator here, app.root, and how can we call that URL? Well, let's say success. So let's beat the same name with success.html. They can be different, but it doesn't matter. So when this URL is visited, we want to execute this function. Let's call this success as well. And we want to say render template success.html. Actually, yeah, return render template success.html. Now this will almost work. Let me save the script. So the app is running, And I say this will almost work because it does work if we visit the URL manually. But if we try to send some data to the server, this still doesn't work, as you see. The reason for that is because in the index.html page, as I said, this is just rendering a file which Flask is not being able to find. So you need to pass Jinja to placeholders here with these double curly brackets. So you would say URL for success. Good. Now I still expect to get another error, but let's see what we get this time. So I want to go step by step, one step at a time, so that you understand things. Yeah. Submit. And this says method not allowed this time. The method is not allowed for the request URL. So the URL was successfully requested, but the method is not allowed. So what method is this? Well, that would be a post method, but by default when you create these decorators here, these implicitly declare a get method. If you want to do a post method, you'd want to explicitly declare that as a list. So post. Save that, go again to your web page, submit, and success. Well, the routings are working correctly, but where are these email and height values? So they are being passed to the server as a post method, but we need to capture them. And to do that, we would capture them inside this success function. So these two values are being generated when the user visits this URL by pressing that button. So at this moment we want to capture these two values. Now sometimes you might also get a get method through this URL. So for that reason you may want to make sure that if request.method equals to post, then what you do is, let's create a variable, say email equals to request.form, and get the form element with the name email name. So what I did here is we want to make sure if we're getting a post request, because the user might also visit this URL through other means, and we want to make sure that's a post request, so we are getting this email and the other height values. And if that's a post request, we grab that email and then we return this template. So this request is the one, the method or the class that we are getting from this import, and that has this method. So this request is being able to read the method of the request and stores that in this method object. And so if that method, if this is equal to post, that we're dealing with a post method. And we want to grab the form element from this request. So this HTTP request has some elements, and if you want, you can look up for that on the internet to learn more about HTTP requests. So there are quite a few things you can read about that. And so this has this form element, and that form element, which you can see from index.html. So this is the form, and this form has this key with this name, and this key has the value that the user enters. So what I could do here, before I go to the height, I could print out the email and see what happens. But I have to keep the console open there. So here is a browser, and here is a console, because we will see the output, hopefully, printed out in the console. So here we go, and let me make a post request. So I'm just sending some data to the server, and obviously this console was from another process that didn't have to do with what we're doing here. So this is the console I wanted to see. And yeah, here we can see the two requests. So the first is a get request, which was the index.html page. So when I reloaded the index.html page, we got a get request. But then I entered this data, and that was a post request to this URL. So the first was the home page, so the slash, and the second was the success URL. And you can see the email address here printed out. Or alternatively, if you want to see how things are working, you could print out the request.form. So let's do the same thing as we did. Yeah, submit this. As you see, this is something called an immutable multi-dict. So it's like a dictionary, and this is holding this data. So email name, the name of that input HTML tag, and then the height name and the value here. So when we do this here, that means we are accessing the value of this dictionary key. Good. Now we can do the same for height. So height request dot form and height name. Now, yeah, let's print them out, and height, just to make sure everything is working correctly. Yeah. Send them. Yeah, here is the email and the height. And yeah, we're doing very well here. We were able to get these two pieces of data. Then what we need to do next is we need to set up this database and then store this data in the database. So we'll be working on PostgreSQL. We'll be doing that throughout the next lectures. So talk to you in the next lecture then.